A walk should be a simple thing. After all, it's just one foot in front of another, then another, then another. But when does a walk turn into a journey? And when does a journey turn into an adventure? The answer is all on the map and the companions you pick up on the way. I'm Jerry Brotton, a map historian, and welcome to What's Your Map? An Oculi Mundi exploration. In this series, we speak to people who live, love and work with maps, making, preserving, interpreting and being inspired by them. In each episode, we ask our guests to unfold a map that's special to them and to tell us the story that lies behind it. Today's guest is an award-winning fantasy writer, a novelist, a translator, a poet, a human rights activist, also a trans activist and a queer activist, a literary and a cultural critic. It is Roz Kaveney. The accolades could go on for a very long time, as Roz has achieved and continues to achieve so much. Thank you for joining us on What's Your Map today, Roz. So my first question is, what's your map?
Well, the map I have in front of me that I'm looking at is actually the Ur version of the map that I fell in love with when I was 11, which is Tolkien's map of Middle-earth at the end of the Third Age. And now this copy is not actually the one I folded out from my first copy of The Lord of the Rings. It's his draft of that map. And it's very interesting because as he wrote the book, he added locations and stuck it all together with bits of brown parcel tape. This is the draft of the map that Tolkien put together as he wrote it.
Tolkien's beautiful hand-drawn map. I mean, he drew these, they're stunning maps.
He drew it, he devised it, he thought of what he wanted to put in his story, drew its geographical location and glued it to the master map with brown parcel tape. So it's a wonderful physical document.
And what do you see? What do you see when you see it?
What do you see? You see, up in the left-hand top, you see the very calm pastoral landscape of the Shire, which is where the hobbits live. And as they leave the Shire on their journey with the Ring of Power, they find themselves in more dangerous territory. And this is all beautifully drawn, and you see a coastline where pirates are going to be, and it's a wonderful example of how plot and story go together.
Because it's got relief, you can see these little stippled areas which seem to be forests and mountains. You have rivers, it's coloured. There's a way in which, as you've really just shown, that you can walk through the story through the map. Yes.
And also there are these places that, and to some extent, the place names help him decide what happens there. You have marked on the borders of Mordor a pass called Cirith Ungol, which in one of the languages he'd invented means the pass of the spider.
Well, there is that sense, isn't there, Roz, that the storyline, the basic shape and plot of The Lord of the Rings, I mean, it is very geographical, isn't it?
It's all about travel as a moral enterprise. The physical journey is also a spiritual journey. It's also about closeness to landscape, because the whole point about the Fellowship of the Ring, the group that forms the heroes of the narrative, is that they walk through this moralised landscape. They don't ride. They don't get the easy option of riding.
Can you almost see the map unfolding, almost literally unfolding, as he's writing?
Yes, I think we can, because we know that he'd get to a point, he'd decide what happens now. Oh, we're at this place, and makes it up, and then draws it, and then sticks it onto the master chart with, as I say, brown parcel tape.
And it's beautiful, isn't it? I mean, he's a great draftsman.
Yeah.
Roz, is this a bit of top left-hand corner? Is that his pipe, tobacco, burning a hole?
I think it may well be.
Why are you obsessed with maps?
Because plot journeys are, in a sense, spiritual journeys. You know, that all fantasy fiction that works is at some level a moral fiction, something I became very much aware of through writing my own. And this is Catholicism coming up. It's like the Stations of the Cross, isn't it?
Is it? Go on.
Well, those people who didn't grow up in Catholicism, there is a thing in Catholic churches which are the 12 points of Christ's journey to the cross, his death and his resurrection. These are 12 points, and you walk around the church saying prayers at each of them, because it's a spiritual journey that is also a physical journey. And I think that's one of the reasons why maps in fiction are important, because they chart the progress of the characters from one state to another state, morally and emotionally as well as physically.
Well, I was thinking about this because I was thinking of saying something to you along the lines of, that the idea that the story is a kind of map, because like a map, it's not a world, actually, but it's a representation of it. It evokes a world.
Yes.
So we think of a map as being spatial, and we think of a novel as being temporal. It's about time and unfolding. Yes. But actually, they're very similar, aren't they?
Yes.
He uses all different kinds of mapping. So he does small-scale cosmologies. So earlier in the 30s, he's even thinking about the origins of the whole fictional universe.
Yes.
Here you have much more a sort of detailed topographical map of movement almost. And then you have him at different points where he's sketching out literally the landscape and almost inserting characters. And there's a bit where is it Helm's Deep, that he has the text across the top, and he's almost trying to write the text and draw the map at the same time.
Well, it's one of the big battle scenes in The Lord of the Rings, Helm's Deep. And it's the one that feels most like the sort of battle he was in, because essentially they're holding a fortress against an overwhelming army of infantry and cavalry. And it's very much a siege, so it's like it's like the trenches.
Well, that's extraordinary. So there's a sense in which also we look at these maps and we think of them very much about imagined faraway places, but they also evoke the terrors of the First World War and Tolkien's involvement.
Which is the thing that formed him in lots of ways.
And does that form the sort of morality to Lord of the Rings as well? Because there is a sense in which there is that moral geography about East and West.
Well, it's partly that. It's also that he was a lieutenant in the trenches. The likely lifespan of a junior officer in the trenches was less than 6 weeks, and he came out the other end. Almost everybody he knew died.
And this is why you go into, I guess, fantasy. You recreate those worlds, but they're absolutely bedrocked on these realities that you've been traumatized by.
Yeah, I mean, there's this wonderful, I can't remember the exact quotation, but Frodo says, "I wish this had not happened in my time." And Gandalf says, "Everyone wishes that about their time, but we have to persevere and endure with the situation we're in." And I remember reading that when I was 11, and it's constantly haunted me, that, that sense that we do not choose our time. We do not choose the historical events we have to live through. If Tolkien has affected me and my career, that's probably the mantra. That sense that you have to work with the situation you're in. You cannot change the historical context you find yourself in. It reminds me very much of a thing in the 19th century poet and writer and designer William Morris's utopian medievalist rant, The Dream of John Ball, where he says that roughly that people fight for a historical issue, and as they fight, it changes under them, And by the time another generation comes along, it's called by another name. And anything you win is only temporary because capitalism constantly reinvent and aristocracy constantly reinvent themselves.
That's interesting because Oscar Wilde also famously said a map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing.
Yes. Well, of course, Wilde, you knew Morris. Wilde used to go to Morris's Sunday afternoon socialist tea parties in Hammersmith. There's one thing I want to add because it's kind of relevant to Tolkien, which is that I have a poem which is essentially a cut-down version of Tolkien's translation of the Battle of Morden, which is a poem about an Anglo-Saxon army up against a superior force of Vikings, and out of honour, they let the Vikings get ashore, knowing that once the Vikings are disembarked, they will be in a stronger position numerically. But honour demands that they give the Vikings the strategic advantage. And the Lord dies at an early stage in the battle, and his men continue to struggle to the end. The only shame is not to fight. Died to a man, but kept the shield wall tight.
Why?
Because what I got from him is that sense that you do not give in, that you fight for what you believe to be right, and you don't count the cost. And you don't. It's not about winning and losing. It's about the spiritual benefit of standing by your principles to the end.
Why, for particularly trans, what we might call queer identities, why is fantasy fiction, and also, in a sense, mapping as a fantasy about creating other worlds, why is that so important for people's identities?
Because of temporality. Because there is the point at which you realise you're queer. There's the point at which you find out what that means in the world. There's the point at which you decide how you can deal with the world in that identity. If you're trans, there's the extent to which you change yourself to fit who you are. Because transness is partly about embodiment. It is, as the Catholics say, an outward sign of inward grace.
And the map is therefore a space that you can get lost in, that you can recreate.
You can take side paths. You can move sideways. You can explore different aspects of yourself. I knew I was trans when I was a teenager. Apparently, I even knew I was trans when I was a small child, but then forgot about it because of a trauma. But then, in my early 20s, after I'd started to transition, I got a long lecture from a senior socialist feminist who explained to me that I was suffering from a false consciousness. I needed to go off and be, if I had to cross-dress, I had to cross-dress, but I was a gay man, and I took a detour from my life at her behest because I suffered from the delusion that other people knew myself better than I did.
And you've been writing about this and writing your memoir and talking about that history in some detail in the novels that you write, in the criticism that you write, even in the translations of the poets that you're interested in, Greco-Roman tradition, also your own work. Tell me about that early point in terms of the interest in fiction and fantasy. And of course, I'm going to ask you about maps, in how that did give you an insight into a sense of yourself, because you were very precocious. I mean, as a young person, and you were clearly using fiction, art, and dare I say it, maps to create senses of who you were or what you thought you were.
Well, yes, but it's partly because I've always been terribly fortunate in my companions, because one of the things about the Tolkien journey is the companions on the road. And when I was 10 and a half, I had for several years a best friend who was smarter and more talented than I was.
Really?
Which is Peter Ackroyd.
Okay.
With whom for many years he was my mass serving partner, both at local parish church and at school, because he was the other scholarship kid at a posh Catholic day school. And as such, we were partners in crime.
And when was that moment when you started transitioning? You were very self-conscious about that. And what was then happening to your intellectual and creative life then?
Well, a lot of the time I was massively in denial because I was struggling with Catholicism. I was constantly lying to my parents about where I was. Because here's the thing, what happened in my teens was that I worked out I was trans. I worked out trans was a thing it was possible to be.
But Roz, this is in the
60s.
This is 60s. What does it mean when you say that you understood that you were trans at that point? Because we're going to talk about that today. But in the 60s, what did that mean for you?
It meant I went away and read Penguin Special by Anthony Storr on sexual deviation. It meant I sat in the local reference library and read the Kinsey report.
So subversive, Roz.
It meant that I discovered, because I was also reading a lot of science fiction and fantasy and comic books, I'd haunt slightly seedy newsagents where I would find imported American paperbacks of science fiction and fantasy. And weirdly enough, in the same racks of comics and magazines, there would also be soft porn, much of it transvestite porn.
Right, yeah.
So, look, there is this magazine called Female Mimics, which is all about these drag queens in New York clubs. Oh, that's interesting. I go. There are exploitation biographies of early transsexuals, like the French trans woman Coccinelle. I read Coccinelle's biography. I read a biography of Lily Elbe, the Danish girl, as in the film, who transitioned in Weimar Germany. I was, at 16, I knew more about being trans than anyone I can imagine having known. And I went and found trans community.
But this was even before that moment of lesbian and gay sort of formation in the 70s, which, again, you were part of. And so this is extraordinary to think about this, because it reminds us that, of course, when we talk about trans identity, we're talking about a long, long history.
Exactly. Well, the thing is, what happened was I worked out that if there were drag queens might know trans people. So I found the drag entertainer in one of the Wakefield pubs, and I asked him. And he put me in touch with a community of trans sex workers that lived in Manchester. So I lied to my parents about what I was doing at weekends and hitchhiked to Manchester. See the journey? There were this group of women who were mostly sex workers, who were hanging around Canal Street, living as women who'd had surgery in most cases, because there was a gender identity unit at the Manchester hospital, and who looked after me and were very responsible. But unfortunately, at one point, I got picked up by a cop for cross-dressing, and he correctively raped me.
But obviously that was
It was colossal trauma, yeah.
It was colossal trauma. And
you have to laugh.
Well, a lot later you do. But, I mean, that period as well it's incredibly conflicted. I mean, the level of misogyny, the level of homophobia. Yeah, it was
horrible. I mean, this is Manchester. It was strange and seedy, and the friends I had were lovely and responsible and kind, and also quite damaged, but also terribly responsible, because they basically said, look, our lives are fairly shitty. You have the chance to do whatever you're going to do, but go to university first, because that will give you more. They were just smart about it. So I didn't run away from home. I didn't transition. I bit the bullet and went to Oxford. And when I needed to, I hitchhiked up to Manchester from Oxford. And of course, I mean, there was a community in London, but I didn't know the London community. I knew the Manchester community. So Manchester was my home base at that point.
Was fantasy a part of your Oxford life? Because there you were in the home of Tolkien and Lewis.
Well, it was part of my Oxford life, but I wasn't. It was very private to me. I mean, there was an Oxford University science fiction group, and I was a member of it, but I never went to its meetings. I just used its library because I was also busily discovering all sorts of books for myself. I mean, this was very much the heyday of a lot of classic fantasy novels being reprinted in America for the first time, and on the back of the pirated paperback, because The Lord of the Rings originally appeared in paperback in America in a semi-pirated edition, and then there had to be an authorized edition. But on the back of that, there was a boom in fantasy fiction that was mostly reprints of earlier work. So I read an awful lot of the books that Tolkien would have read, like Eddings, like Morris's prose romances. And I read books by his contemporaries, like Hope Mirrlees, who was a minor Bloomsbury figure who wrote a great fantasy novel called Blood in the Mist.
So were you thinking that you were set to be a writer at this point? Because
absolutely. I assumed I was going to be a writer. I absolutely assumed I was going to be a poet. I was writing mostly not very good poetry. I was planning to be an academic.
By the early 1970s, you're in London, and what I know you for is
I was coming to London. I was still based in Oxford, but I was coming to London in order to work on the William Morris manuscripts in the British Library. I knew that the Gay Liberation Front existed and had been doing things while I was doing finals at Oxford. So once I was regularly coming to London, I went round to the Caledonian Road office and said, "Hi, think I'm trans. Do you have a trans group?" And they said, "Yes, we do. Rachel Pollock and her partner, Edith Katz, are running it. You should go and talk to them," which was the start of a 50-year friendship.
And how did the manifesto develop from that friendship?
This is, as I always say, here's the thing. The manifesto exists. I'm one of the signatories. I don't remember a blind thing about writing it. And the reason is, as I perpetually explain to young people, you've no idea how incredibly stoned we were all the time.
But as you got to read it subsequent to being stoned...
It's amazing. I mean, it still works. It's still inherently intersectional. It's very much about, let's not be divided by... I mean, it was the transvestite, transsexual and drag queen group. There was this whole obsession with not letting what we would now call the narcissism of small differences divide us. It was very much about physical, spiritual and body autonomy, and people making up their own mind and not having doctors tell them how to be who they were.
And what would be the most meaningful protest that you've been involved in, would you say?
I think probably the first Pride.
Which was in?
1972.
And why was that
because
so powerful?
It was a bunch of people standing up for themselves and saying, here we are, this is who we are, screw you. It was just a bunch of us walking down Oxford Street, kissing each other, shouting, "We're here, we're queer, and we're not going shopping." Holding a kiss in Hyde Park. The police, who would cheerfully have arrested all of us for what we were doing, knowing that this time they couldn't do that. Watching the police the look of impotence on the face of bigoted cops was great. Looking at the public going, I saw the public cheering us on, because, the British love an underdog.
Beautiful. What's the future like? What do you aspire to? What are you hoping? Even in
hope is a snare and a delusion. You don't struggle because you're going to win. You struggle because the struggle is the important thing to do. The struggle is the moral journey. As the guy says in that great movie Galaxy Quest, never give up, never surrender.
So it's about the journey, not the destination. It's a bit like drawing a map.
Exactly so.
Roz Kaveney, thank you so much for joining me on What's Your Map?
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for listening to What's Your Map? I'm Jerry Brotton, map historian, and this has been an Oculi Mundi exploration. Oculi Mundi is the online home of the Sunderland collection of antique maps and atlases. The series producer is Emily Uchida Finch, and it's a Whistledown production.